You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Mint is still $15 a month for premium wireless. And if you haven't made the switch yet, here are 15 reasons why you should. 1, it's $15 a month. 2, seriously, it's $15 a month. 3, no big contracts. 4, I use it. 5, my mom uses it. Are you playing me off? That's what's happening, right? Okay, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, $15 per month equivalent required. New customer offer first 3 months only. Then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See mintmobile.com.
Anyone can follow. It takes something special to be an original. Which is why the 2025 Lincoln Navigator SUV arrives with new ways of surrounding you in luxury, including the ultra-wide 48-inch panoramic display and the multi-sensory Lincoln Rejuvenate experience. A true original never stops evolving. So meet the 2025 Navigator, the original that's all new and better than ever. Learn more at Lincoln.com. Lincoln and Navigator are trademarks of Ford or its affiliates.
Hello everyone and welcome to History of the Second World War, episode 235, The Battle After Britain Part 3, The Blitz. This week, a big thank you goes out to Timothy for supporting the podcast by becoming a member. Members get access to ad-free versions of all of the podcast episodes, plus special member-only episodes released roughly once a month. Head on over to historyofthesecondworldwar.com/members to find out more. The Blitz is one of those moments during the Second World War that is recognizable even outside of those groups with firm knowledge about the war. For those who listen to the podcast, the Blitz might conjure all kinds of different mental images right now. Broadly, the Blitz was a strategic bombing campaign of Britain staged by the Luftwaffe through a series of nighttime bombing raids that lasted from roughly the second week of September until May 1941. The most well-known target was London, which, due to its size and importance, would receive most of the attention from the British press. However, it was far from the only area of Britain bombed during late 1940 and early 1941. Many other cities were hit hard, with some reaching bomb concentrations that were similar to what fell onto the hardest hit areas of London. For the purposes of this podcast episode, we will primarily focus on the bombing that occurred in late 1940, in the direct aftermath of the postponement of Operation Sea Lion. Unlike the daylight battles over Britain, RAF Fighter Command would be ill-prepared to meet the night bombing efforts of the Luftwaffe during these months. During the pre-war period and then up until the summer of 1940, Dowding and Fighter Command had been solely focused on one thing: increasing the ability of the RAF to meet daylight bombing raids. Spitfires, Hurricanes, and radar were essential pieces of that effort. The idea of engaging enemy bombers at night did not receive the same amount of attention, and this left them without the tools necessary to properly counter the new Luftwaffe threat. The only good news for the RAF was that the Luftwaffe was just as ill-prepared for a truly strategic bombing campaign as they were to meet it. The Luftwaffe as a force was designed to destroy or at least damage very specific targets, but instead, they were now trying to damage the wartime infrastructure of an entire nation. Their focus had been in providing tactical support for German ground forces, and now they had to try and deliver enough bombs to have an impact on British industry and morale. It was a different task that no air force, to be clear, was truly prepared to conquer in 1940. But the Luftwaffe would try, and thousands upon thousands of tons of bombs would be dropped, primarily on population centers around Britain, to try and achieve that goal. The hallmark of the Blitz was not the destruction of military targets, airfields, or radar stations, but instead the impact that would have on normal British citizens and the death and suffering that they would have to endure. The impact of the air war would begin months before the beginning of the Blitz, and in fact for much of the Battle of Britain, there would be a lot of press time and energy devoted to both tracking the actions in the air and in finding fun ways to present them to readers. Most of our information about the thoughts and morale of normal citizens comes from the mass observation efforts of the British government as they tracked morale and the effect of various government propaganda efforts on that morale. One of the items noted by these reports was the fact that the scores of the daily air battles became an area of interest to much of the country, tracking them in the same way that a sports score would be tracked, like a cricket score or something. The new scores would be released almost daily, using the often highly exaggerated numbers that were initially reported by pilots. General Ismay, one of the most important military advisors for Churchill after he became Prime Minister, would later write, quote, "All London, nay, all England, could think of little else. What is the score today? Was the question on every lip in bus, tube, factory, and office. The hall porters at hotels and clubs had to supply the answer a dozen times a day." End quote. The inaccuracy of these estimates has been a major theme of the last few episodes of the podcast, but the flimsiness of the estimates were not known or communicated to the average individual in 1940. Instead, they were just shown the information distilled into a few numbers, which was quite positive for the RAF because they were using RAF numbers. The story that these numbers told was one of tremendous victory for Fighter Command and disaster for the Luftwaffe, which we know today was inaccurate, but at the time, that was not really understood. Before we discuss the Blitz and its impact, though, we do have to dig just a bit deeper into these mass observation reports, because they are a critical source that is used so often in histories of this period. These reports were gathered based on individuals who lived within British society and who were working with the government to gather information. They would report on conversations they had with local leaders, business owners, just random people around them. These reports would then be summarized from local to regional and finally to national level. But as Brad Bevan and John Griffiths point out in their article, The Blitz, Civilian Morale in the City, Mass Observation and Working Class Culture in Britain, 1940 to 41, the type of people who were often doing the data gathering and then the collation and summarization process often resulted in problems with the data. They would say, quote, "Since MO represented a middle-class interpretation of working-class reaction to the Blitz, the final reports tended to reflect a preoccupation with regional stereotypes, disregarding other possible facets of working-class life. In many respects, the MO researchers simply reflected contemporary assumptions on the nature of working-class life. For example, researchers recorded a high level of morale in Liverpool, which was explained by the unique, hardy character of the city's population." End quote. This type of bias became worse the higher up the chain the reports went, with each step up the ladder taking it further and further away from the source and further away from individuals who understood the people and the location that the information was obtained from. This does not mean that the MO reports are useless, just that they have to be interpreted and cannot always be taken just at face value. This is really important because if you ever hear about the morale of the people of Britain during the Blitz, during the Battle of Britain, during the war in general, the source of that, from wherever you're reading that, if it's on the internet, in a book, in an article, a YouTube video, a silly podcast, those are all being sourced from these reports. And so it's good to have an understanding of where that information came from and the problems that could be sort of embedded within that information. While the Blitz, as a distinct period of time during the war, would not begin until around the middle of September, the night bombing of areas within Britain had been occurring for several months before that. During those bombing efforts, the Germans were greatly aided by their efforts at making radio navigation possible for their bombers, which was their attempt to solve the number one problem faced by bombers when trying to complete raids by night: how to find the target and how to find out where they were. The German usage of radio was discussed in detail back in episode 209, but as a summary, the Germans would use two different radio transmitters, which were set up to cross near where the bombers should drop their bombs. So all the German bombers had to do was follow one beam so that they flew in the correct direction, and then they could drop their bombs a few minutes after crossing the second beam. While this method was not perfect, and there would be British efforts to spoof and confuse the system, it did represent a major leap in terms of accuracy for night bombing efforts, which would become critical when the Luftwaffe shifted all their bombers to nighttime operations during the Blitz. While London would go down in history as the primary target for that bombing campaign, the areas given greater focus before September were some of the major ports of South and Southeast England. Liverpool and Birkenhead were high on the list of targets during August, as the Luftwaffe saw them as dual-purpose targets. By attacking and damaging the port facilities, not only did they impact the critical British sea traffic, but they could also impact the ability of the Royal Navy to use those ports in their efforts to counterattack any German invasion attempt. One very intense period for these port cities was during the last days of August and the first days of September, during which the Luftwaffe bombers would visit them every night on 4 consecutive nights. During this time, they would launch 629 bombing sorties and drop almost 500 tons of bombs and 1,000 incendiary devices. But even with all those bombs and all that effort, the damage that was sustained by the actual dock facilities in both Liverpool and Birkenhead was minimal. This was a good example of how difficult it would be to achieve truly decisive effects during nighttime bombing raids for large and relatively hardy targets like dock facilities. They were not necessarily hard to hit due to their size, but it was hard to hit them enough or in the right place to cause just the right type of damage that was needed to seriously impact their ability to contribute to the British war effort. This same challenge would also be faced by the Luftwaffe any time they would try to attack specific targets in London, as they would try to do when they bombed London over the course of 57 consecutive nights starting in the middle of September. Some of these raids would try and target specific infrastructure, but in other cases they were more structured around just terror bombing of the population, and in these efforts they were both successful and unsuccessful. The bombing of civilians had occupied a very important position in war planning for many nations before the Second World War. The belief at the time was that the mass bombing raids on cities would be absolutely devastating, with some strategic bombing zealots claiming that just a few raids with the bombing forces available in the mid-1930s could end a war just by themselves due to the death and destruction that they could cause. These predictions had been a major driver in investments made into strategic bombing forces around the world. When the bombing of London started, parts of these predictions would prove to be accurate, and the destruction of buildings and infrastructure was a problem. But the deaths caused by the bombing raids were actually far below estimates, and instead of hospitals overflowing with injured civilians and morgues bursting at the seams with those who had been killed, instead, the greatest problem became supporting everyone who survived but was suddenly without any shelter. This left the British government unprepared for what they actually needed to do, which was to be prepared to address infrastructure damage on a massive scale over a period of months. To quote an article from the Daily Herald, quote, "In this Battle of Britain, I have seen ordinary people behaving with a coolness and resource in the face of danger which one would have only expected from veteran troops. But you do not expect frontline troops to stand unarmed without support under bombardment." End quote. Now, there were centers set up in the larger cities to try and help with the problem of people not having any place to live, but they were overwhelmed with people. Even during September, just at the very beginning of the Blitz, the London centers would fill with almost 26,000 people. Those that arrived after found the centers full and were forced to figure something out on their own, often by trying to live with relatives or friends. It's a great example of the power of social networks, but only due to the failings of the government systems that were put in place. During the 57 nights of the bombing of London, sadly around 40,000 people were killed, but also 1 million homes were either destroyed or damaged, leaving many people without adequate shelter. Even houses that were not destroyed completely would still be damaged to the point where they were at the very least temporarily uninhabitable. Near misses could result in roofs being blown off, or windows being smashed, or walls being damaged. These would have been minor inconveniences, if not for the fact that it was also happening to so many other homes simultaneously, which overwhelmed all forms of organized support from the government or from local groups. An added complexity to these issues was the problem of unexploded bombs. Within any strategic bombing campaign, when thousands and thousands of bombs are being dropped in one area, some percentage of them will not explode. This could be due to malfunction in the triggering mechanism or in the bomb payload, but also was just kind of part of the equation that everybody expected. And this meant that at one point in time in late October, there were 3,000 unexploded bombs just hanging out around London, waiting for somebody to come take care of them. Moving a bomb was, of course, not an easy process and required delicate handling by trained teams. But there were only so many of those trained teams, and the bombs just had to sit there sometimes, waiting for somebody to come look at it. At times, these were within homes, which forced not just that home to be evacuated, but also the surrounding area, just in case the bomb decided to explode, which could happen at any moment. There were bomb shelters to protect people during the raids, but these were never designed for long-term habitation. In fact, just the fact that people were being forced to stay in them for long periods at night, every night, was beyond what they were initially designed for. Most of the shelters in London and around Britain were designed for short periods of sheltering from bombing raids, generally during the day. The theory was that there would be air raid warnings, people could stay in the shelter for maybe a few hours, and then they could go about their day. But the night bombing raids were different because They could occur over a period of several hours every night, and most of the shelters did not have any kind of sleeping accommodations or even toilet facilities. For the people who had built personal bomb shelters and the somewhat infamous, I guess you could call it, Anderson shelters that were built in large numbers, the situation was even worse because they were also small and cramped and often very, very damp. The end result was that a lot of people chose to take shelter in one of two ways. The first was to simply stay in their homes. For many people, especially as the bombing raids continued every night after night after night, they almost became routine, and staying in their homes seemed like simply the best option. It helped people get some rest, which was critical for those who were still having to work during the day, and the desire and need for sleep would only grow in everyone as the days and nights drug on. But there was also just the emotional comfort of being in their own home, around their own things, in their own space. There was also some amount of fatalism that would creep in, with the complete randomness of the bombing fostering a sense of, if not helplessness, then acceptance that death could come at any time during a raid, and the acceptance of that was the best path forward. The other path that some individuals took was to shelter not in dedicated shelters, not in their homes, but instead in the London tube stations, which is a conversation all by itself. Hey guys, millions of men have problems with ED every year. Maybe that's you. Maybe you don't want to talk about it because nobody wants to talk about it, but it happens, and RexMD is here to help. RexMD is a licensed provider of ED medication, and it starts with just a short, simple quiz to help determine the best path forward for you. Everybody is different. There are no one-size-fits-all treatments, but RexMD has all of the options. Oh, and after some private consultations, your personal treatment arrives directly to your door in discreet packaging. You are not alone. RexMD has been chosen by 475,000 men. So if you need to be ready when the mood strikes, head on over to rexmd.com/SWW to get up to 95% off your ED treatment. See full details and usage at rexmd.com. Prescription required. Results may vary. Visit rexmd.com/SWW and get up to 95% off your ED treatment. Thank you, RexMD, for sponsoring this episode.
This is Marshawn Lynch. On Prize Picks, being right can get you paid. So I'm here to make sure you don't miss any of the action this football season. With Prize Picks, it's good to be right. With millions of members and billions of dollars awarded in winnings, Prize Picks is the best place to put your takes to the test. The app is really simple to use and available in 40 plus states, including California, Texas, and Georgia. Just pick 2 or more players across any sport. Pick more or less on their projections, and if you're right, you can cash in. With simple stats and fan-friendly policies, Prize Picks is the best place to make your picks. Most importantly, they don't play about your paper. All transactions on the apps are fast, safe, and secure.
Download the Prize Picks app today and use code SPOTIFY to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code SPOTIFY to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks. It's good to be right. Must be present in certain states. Visit prizepicks.com for restrictions and details.
The use of the London tube stations as bomb shelters is a topic that has become a very famous and well-known part of the Blitz story. But at the time, it was a very divisive topic. On one hand, you just think about what a London tube or subway station is, and it sounds like a perfect bomb shelter. They are underground structures with easy access, if maybe constricted sometimes, and they were built out of a large amount of concrete underground. That's perfect. Some of them were quite far underground, due to London geography as well. Inside of the stations, there were often wide stretches of flat floors designed for people to easily walk over. It was clear to everyone why they might be used as shelters during bomb raids, and it was because of this that the British government firmly rejected them for that purpose. The official policy was that they should not and could not be used as shelters, first because there were concerns that civilians would refuse to leave them during the day, but more importantly, because people using them for that reason would prevent people from using them for their intended purpose as a critical part of the London transportation system. There were fears that this would simply be too disruptive to business and also military processes in London, And so during the initial bombings of London, there were guards posted at tube station entrances to deny people access during raids. Some people got around this by buying a ticket and then just not boarding a train, but efforts were also made to prevent this from happening. However, as the bombing continued and as public pressure continued to mount, the official policies were forced to change. And at some point, it would become a serious public morale issue if these seemingly perfect bomb shelters were not being used as bomb shelters. And so the policies were changed, and the stations were opened as shelters every night. Initially, there was a bit of chaos in the stations, and people just sort of packed themselves in and then tried to find ways to get some sleep while staying at the station all night. But eventually, each station would begin to self-manage, with committees established among the people who stayed in them to try and organize how people use them and also to ensure that everyone was doing their part to keep them workable. This included building out bunks, organizing sleeping areas, even opening canteens for people to use. These committees then even worked with similar committees in other tube stations to share ideas and information for the use of all, with around 30 stations eventually setting up a Tube Shelters Conference in December. This type of grassroots organization, in my mind, is one of the most encouraging parts of this period, of people coming together and working together for the betterment of everyone. There was some concern among the government, though, with one home intelligence report saying, quote, "People sleeping in shelters are more and more tending to form committees among themselves, often communist in character, to look after their own interests and to arrange dances and entertainments," end quote. As far as I have found, there is no actual evidence that there was any threats of some kind of communist revolution coming from these simple tube shelter committees. Nothing of that sort. The closest type of action was a peaceful sit-in demonstration that was led by known communist Phil Pertolin at an underground shelter at the Savoy Hotel. However, Pertolin's sit-in was mostly just to protest the fact that the shelter at the Savoy was much better equipped and provisioned than public shelters, and it was, of course, only reserved for higher-class individuals. The protest was not against the government even, but instead the classist structure that still pervaded in London. The fact that these fears were present in reports is a great example of how wildly anti-communist the British government was at this point, and also how concerned they were about a possible communist action among the populace. But what it did do, importantly for the people who were benefiting from the shelter committees, is that it prompted the government into action. By the end of the year, they were providing both equipment and were doing work to enhance the facilities at many tube stations. This included providing food for people who were sheltering, replacing some of the need for the committees in the first place. But for many of the committees, this was seen as a great victory. They weren't communist revolutionaries. They had not failed because the government had come in and started providing things, because one of their key goals was to prompt the government into action, and they had done that. Although oddly enough, the government had waited so long that they only took action after the period of greatest need had already passed. This is because the usage of tube stations as shelters peaked during the time where London was being bombed every night, those 57 nights in a row, and it would begin to drop when bombing raids became less frequent. This meant that by the time of the government's actions, and the government's actions were beginning to have an effect, most people had stopped using the tube stations anyway. While the story of the tube stations and their use as shelters is important, it is worth noting that most people did not shelter in tube stations, or really any public shelters, and the number of people who used them was quite small relative to the number of people who simply stayed in their homes and just sort of hoped for the best. The tube stations, though, and their interaction with the Blitz, was also an experience that was unique to London, but the Blitz occurred in many areas of Britain during late 1940 and early 1941. In fact, of the people killed or seriously injured by German bombing after November 1940, most of them would be outside of London. The general structure of these raids was for the Luftwaffe to attack a specific city or a set of targets over multiple successive nights, the idea being that this would cause enough damage to cause lasting damage to the targets. However, this often proved to be inadequate, and in most cases the areas targeted by the Luftwaffe would be back mostly to normal within about a week. This was a testament to the resiliency of the local populations and the local infrastructure, but also simply to the inadequate resources that the Luftwaffe had available to it during this period. But this did not mean that individuals did not suffer serious damage in many areas around Britain. This would eventually force the government to make a policy change. Initially, the policy of the British government was that if personal property was damaged, the cost of those damages was to be handled by the individual. This policy would shift greatly after the bombing of late 1940 and early 1941. A series of government bills and acts would be put in place under the title of war damages, which eventually set up a system of government-sponsored insurance where individual property owners would pay some amount of tax on their property, and then they could make damage claims on that property should it be damaged by a German air raid. The goal of this structure was to spread out the cost of the damage among all of society, with the government guaranteeing that they would make up for any shortfall between the money taken in and dispersed through the insurance processes. This was greatly antithetical to the economic ideas of pre-war Britain, which was a highly individualistic society, but was essentially forced on the government by the scale of the destruction that the Luftwaffe inflicted upon average, everyday members of British society. It's a great example of how, in times of great disaster, sometimes individualist government policies are hard to sustain, especially when the destruction and damages are so random among society, and they just sort of happen to people without them having done anything wrong. Eventually, the War Damage Commission would handle 4 million claims and pay out more than 1.3 billion pounds of money to property owners to repair their property. Now, something that could have protected that property more proactively would have been Fighter Command. And given the overall discussions of this entire series of the podcast, you may have noticed that up until this point in this episode, I have not mentioned Fighter Command a single time in relation to German night bombing. This is for a very good reason. During the pre-war years, almost all the time, money, and effort of Fighter Command was put into building up the ability to counter German daylight bombing raids. They had not put the same amount of effort into building out the ability to intercept nighttime German raids. There were two basic problems that Fighter Command did not have the ability to solve in the summer of 1940 that they would have to solve if they wanted to successfully meet and deter the German raids. The first was the ability to track raids after they crossed the coast. The chain home system was designed and structured to track German raids over the Channel and the North Sea. They did not necessarily have the capability of tracking raids after they were over land, which was not a huge problem during the day because a series of watchers on the ground could track progress, and the aircraft themselves had the ability to search when they were in the air. These same abilities were not available in the darkness. Watchers on the ground could not see the German raids, and fighters did not have the ability to visually search for enemy aircraft once they were in the air. The second major problem was that the fighters themselves were basically useless at night. Aerial combat was a confusing mess of chaos, even at the best of times, and at night it was almost impossible for any pilot to get into position to attack an enemy aircraft without the ability to see where the enemy aircraft was. It was generally accepted that for a successful interception at night, the fighter had to be within 250 meters of the target, which was just not within the range of possibilities from radar on the ground. It just wasn't exact enough. It was difficult enough to get the fighters within the 25 kilometers that was considered reasonable for daylight interception, and 25 kilometers is quite a bit different than 250 meters. The solution to these problems was known in the form of aerial radar, but this was not something that could be easily just thrown onto a fighter due to the size and weight requirements that such a system brought with it. The basic concept of aerial interception radar was understood, and in fact the first successful aerial interception using radar for the RAF would occur in late July 1940, when Flying Officer Glenn Ashfield would be part of a crew of a Blenheim that was equipped with such a radar and would make an interception during the night. It was somewhat remarkable when you read about what was happening during these interceptions and what it allowed the pilots to do, which was essentially to get into position to engage an enemy without even being able to see them. Here's a quote from Flying Officer Ashfield. "We flew full throttle while inside the aerial radar range, and at about 400 to 500 yards I opened fire. I could not see, so I closed with continuous fire, and by the huge fireworks display which resulted from the bullets making contact, I knew the aim to be okay. I continued to fire until, with the enemy aircraft looking the size of a house, it gave a lurch to starboard and nose fell. I attempted to follow it while still firing, when the whole of the cabin was covered with oil from the enemy aircraft. In the next few seconds, we were on our back and recovery was not made until 700 feet, by which time we had lost contact with the enemy." End quote. Unfortunately, research on this successful interception seems to show that they actually brought down another Blenheim, which was returning from a night raid on the continent rather than the expected Dornier 17, which they thought they shot down, which goes a long way to display the effectiveness of the radar, but also the challenges that still had to be overcome. Because if that interception had happened during the day, it's basically impossible that they would have shot down their own aircraft because they would have been able to see that it was a Blenheim, and that would have at the very least caused them to be more hesitant. Even if the RAF could solve some of those problems, though, for the RAF, the biggest problem in late 1940 was one of volume. There simply were never enough night fighters equipped with radars during the months of the Blitz, and really it would not be until the Bow fighter entered service in larger numbers in mid-1941 that the nighttime aerial interception problem was solved, just in time for the Luftwaffe to de-emphasize nighttime bombing of Britain in favor of activities in Eastern Europe. If fighters were not really an option for the British, the obvious second answer would be ground-based anti-aircraft fire, but in this area there were also serious issues. The core issue for the British anti-aircraft guns throughout the entirety of the Battle of Britain was simply that there were never enough of them. This was true during the daylight raids of London, and the sheer lack of volume of fire would hinder their ability to have an impact on the fighting during the day. When asked to fire at German bombers at night, there were additional problems to deal with that there was no easy way to find an answer for. The most important problem was that a major part of the targeting for anti-aircraft fire was through the use of sound. This was a more tried and true system at a time when it was not possible to direct guns via radar. Sound, of course, worked great at night, but only if the German bombers were closely packed in groups, so that their sound came from one location. This was not how the nighttime raids were being structured, and instead they were structured so that bombers would fly in loose formation and would be strung out over a very wide distance. This actually increased the impact of the German bombers because it kept the raid happening for longer, which kept the sirens on, which kept people sheltering, and kept people awake. It also made it basically impossible to use sound-based targeting because the sound was coming from simply too many different sources. Large searchlights could be used to try and pinpoint specific aircraft, but this also required a certain number to always be active because not every searchlight would find a bomber, and of course there were never enough searchlights. Without the ability to find the exact position of bombers and to properly aim the anti-aircraft gun, one option was to conserve ammunition due to the difficulty of hitting anything. But there were concerns that if the guns did not fire at all, civilian morale would drop because they would believe that they were not being protected. And so the opposite approach was taken, and instead of not firing the anti-aircraft guns, they would instead be told to shoot even more. This was great for civilian morale. There was so much anti-aircraft fire. Wow, amazing. But for the most part, due to its lack of effectiveness, it might as well have just been a fireworks display. The anti-aircraft guns did hit German bombers, and they were not worthless. In August, for example, they destroyed 16 German bombers during night raids, but they did not necessarily make up for the resources that they were spending on their very large firing displays. Another issue for the anti-aircraft guns is that at times it was difficult for the British to determine what exactly the Germans were even trying to hit during their bombing raids, with hindsight allowing us to know that many of the raids were actually targeted on what could be considered valid targets, like dock facilities or factories. However, they were at times so inaccurate that the British had no idea what they were actually trying to accomplish. For example, one raid that we know was trying to hit the dock facilities in Liverpool had bombs dropping within a 65-kilometer area. That's massive. This made it impossible to even really determine what the epicenter was. On the German side, it was also difficult for some Luftwaffe leaders to determine what they were trying to do, with one Luftwaffe officer writing later in the war that in retrospect, quote, "The bombing of Britain in 40-41 consisted neither of a policy nor a program, although its basis consisted of plans and intentions of both a strategic and tactical nature." End quote. There were moments where it was clear that German focus was shifting, with one of the more famous being the shift to a focus on bombing Coventry in mid-November, and the shift would be the start of 31 major nighttime raids of various industrial cities around Britain instead of the laser focus on London, which had been the focus up to that point. These raids of all types would continue to kill people, would continue to destroy some buildings and infrastructure, but the Luftwaffe, because of its lack of policy and program, was never able to mount the kind of continuous and concentrated campaign that would have a lasting impact. The Blitz itself would drag on for months, into the spring of 1941. The death and destruction would continue. The slow, steady attrition of Luftwaffe bombers would continue. But the Luftwaffe's goals would never get closer to completion. Sure, they would kill 40,000 people, injure probably around twice that number, destroy millions of homes and other buildings. There would be so many hours of lost sleep. There would be countless sleepless nights for the people of London and other cities. But the goal of the Blitz, to break the spirit of Britain, would not only not be achieved, in some ways the opposite would occur, and the damage caused would only unite the British population to ever greater support for final victory. The Blitz spirit of late 1940 and early 1941, the ability of everyday British people to just sort of soldier on, would become legendary, a lasting legacy of not just the Battle of Britain, but also the entirety of the Second World War. It gets called back to from time to time, even in modern Britain, although at this point it has shifted into the mythical past of a nation that has changed greatly over the last 80 years. The Blitz would also be the final stage of the Battle of Britain. And so next episode, we will close up the series by looking at numbers, results, and what both the British and the Germans plan to do next.